the first psalm with the heading of Miktam. If you have the ESV, the footnotes in the ESV say that this is probably a musical or a liturgical term. It's either something to do with the music or something to do with the worship. The active word there in that footnote is probably, because literally nobody knows. There is basically no consensus among anybody. There's a lot of speculation and little of it's useful. But there is one thing Miktams usually do. Whatever the word means, and that's up for debate. Miktams are almost always associated with historical events where the author is in great danger. 16 is one of two that does not do that. It's only used 6 times in the book of Psalms, including chapter 16. Before we get into the text of this one, if you turn over to 56, there's a series of Miktams that begin in 56 all the way through 60. And the Miktams that are there, with the exception of 58, with the exception of 58, all of those highlight a particular event in David's life. So 56, if you're reading the heading there, written in regard to when the Philistines seized David in Gath. 57 is when he fled from Saul in the cave. 59 is when Saul sent men to watch his house in order to kill him. And then 60 seems to be later, when Joab struck down 12,000 of Edom in the Valley of Salt. They all seem to point to his danger for the psalmist, David. Some people believe that 16 and 58 should probably do that as well. Should is the word. Again, we don't know. But that's as close as we can get to the occasion for why this might have been written. It does give you the idea reading through it that perhaps danger is involved. It begins in verse 1 with the words, "Preserve me, O Lord," or "O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he's at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Like we said a moment ago, this is a Miktam, and this was the note I said just a second ago. Normally they're written in times of great danger. This psalm really gives you the idea of a psalm of trust. That's where most people place this. There's not really a complaint. There is praise in different places, but it's really a psalm saying, this is what I'm going to do. I am going to put my trust in you. And it is an individual psalm because David is writing it from his perspective. He says, preserve me, I take refuge, my delight, you make known to me, that's singular. So he's not writing on behalf of Israel generally. This initially was written just concerning himself. Would have been true for them, but initially it was for himself. This psalm, the authorship is confirmed in Acts chapter 2. Because Peter quotes this for the first time in Acts 2, Paul's going to quote it later in Acts 13. Paul doesn't say who said this, but Peter does. Peter attributes the words of the psalm to David. There's always an argument in the literature about did David ever actually write the Psalms, and at least for this one, we have a pretty strong vote for yes, because Peter said so, right? Peter said David said this, so it confirms that for you. What do you see? What do you notice? What catches your eye in the psalm What do you think about it?
It catches my eye as it's used in Acts 2.
Well, there is that, right? There is the line. Verse 10 should get your attention, right? Well, and we're studying Acts, and aren't we doing Acts 2 on Sunday? See, there you go. It's a perfect segue into another discussion. But
it almost feels, I thought it was interesting, it almost feels like he's taking you on a tour. He's showing you his observations or his beliefs or things he sees.
it's a good way to put that.
Or, almost you're like with him. And he says, over here you have the saints that are, and so on and so forth. It's kind of interesting. That's kind of the impression I got.
Yeah, it's like he's describing the way he's trusting the Lord, and in doing that, he's kind of leading you, okay, here are the different ways I trust in the Lord, right? With regard to the saints, like you said in verse 3, they are the ones in whom David delights. And then you kind of turn, well, now you got these other folks that are not saintly. They're doing pretty terrible things. I'm not having anything to do with them. So he's using these different ways of saying, here's how I trust in God, right? Yes.
And this psalm is much more positive in its sequence. I know.
Well, it's very positive.
But it's much more positive than the prior ones that we've talked about.
Yes. Book 1 of the Psalms is predominantly negative. It's mostly lament. But you get these moments like this, where Psalm 16, there's basically the only real indication of anything negative is in verse 1, right? He's asking for preservation, and that implies danger, but not as direct as some other ones. All right. What else do you see? What do you notice? Yeah.
Okay, I'll take us off the rails early.
Yeah, that's right. We're ready. I'm ready for it.
One thing that kind of stuck out is just the verbiage of the blood offering.
Yes.
I will not drink of the cup of your blood offering. And I'm not sure, and you could probably answer this better. I'm thinking of where would you see paganism before this? Like, you have Genesis 9, where you have Leviticus, where the consuming blood is a law. All taught. You don't do that. Then you have Exodus, where blood is there for salvation or deliverance, but you never really see anything about blood offering as in, like, this context of paganism and the extreme separation that he draws here. He talks about how close he is to God, but then he contrasts it with the extremity of a blood offering that someone's.
I think you've caught on the note of extreme. So on the positive side of the extreme, I think that's how he describes the faithful in verse 3, right? The saints in the land, that word for saints is very similar to the word for holy. In fact, it has the same root, I think. So that holy is usually something you describe God as, right? So he's like saying, on the extreme positive, these most holy ones, I'm with them, and then, like you said, the most awful of the awful, I want nothing to do with them, right? In terms of how familiar they were with blood sacrifice, I have no idea. But they knew something of it.
There's something there that
they knew something about it.
Land were that far degenerated.
Yeah, well, and God had said to the Israelites coming into there, I'm not just giving you this land because you're great. I'm giving you this land because they've done the abominable, right? They've done the really, truly awful. And because of that, they're being spit out of their land, and I'm letting you in. So God certainly knew the depth of their depravity, right? Yes, sir.
There's a reference in Psalms 106, 37. It says, they even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood.
So another version of the very worst of the worst, right? Absolutely. They had forsaken God, and they had went completely, into depravity, about as far as you could go, right? Trust mankind always come up with a way to go lower, right? But this is a way of saying this is the absolute worst of the worst, right? And David's like, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. I'm not even going to say their names, right? That's how detestable it is. I'm not even going to talk about it, right, in this context. Okay? Other things that stand out to you about the psalm? Yep. And then 1, 2.
seems like, at least the way my version reads and as I read through it, it seems like it's very confident.
Absolutely.
Just like some of the statements are very confident in how they're worded, but also I thought it was interesting that in verse 7, I can't remember what that version says, like the Christian Standard Version says, I will bless the Lord who counsels me.
Mm-hmm.
But then it goes, and then goes on in 8 and says, I will always let the Lord guide me.
Right.
Think about just David and his walk and many different things that took place over his life. And it kind of does, I guess I don't know when this was written, but almost I don't know, it just seems weird to think about him to say, I will bless the Lord, and then also say, I will always let the Lord guide me. And then you think about some different things that took place and you kind of go,
Yeah. You kind of go, wait a minute. You haven't always, David.
yeah, but it sounds very confident reading it.
It's, in a sense, this is what I want to do. This is the person I want to be, right? He's almost describing an ideal. I will always set the Lord before me. And if he veils that, it doesn't mean that was an unworthwhile thing to say. That's what he knows he needs to do and he wants to do, right? There are moments when he's going to fail at that. You mentioned you had the Christian Standard Version.
Mm-hmm.
What's the second half of verse 7 say in that?
Even at night when my thoughts trouble me.
Okay. The ESV had instructs me. I think the thought there is, and other writers have noticed this, conscience being the idea. It's like I'm even bothered at night whenever I don't do that, right? Even maybe the things I have done have really set on me because I know I'm on this different path and I remember what I was, right? And that bugs him. So it's interesting that CSB picked up on that. I had Ryan and then you're next.
Two things. One, verse 7, I just thought how neat it was that it ties in with Psalm 1.
Yes.
When you look at the way that, it talks about the opposite, the counsel of the wicked and, the seat of the scoffers and walking in the paths of sinners. And yet, what is my delight? It's meditating on his law day and night. So you get that same idea of what you were just saying about the nighttime, how that bothers me because my mind is on things above.
Yep.
And who is my counsel? He is my counsel. That's who counsels me, right? The other thing I thought was neat is somebody told me this before I marked it in my Bible, but this psalm has bookends. What I mean by that is, keep me safe, O God, for in you I take refuge. It said, why? Because verse 11, you've made known to me the paths of life. You filled me with joy in your presence and with your eternal pleasures at your right hand. It just kind of neat how somebody explained that, gave that example.
Yeah, the request is met by the answer to it at the end. That happens a lot, right? That whatever's complained about is sometimes at the end of the psalm solved or figured out. And sometimes it's in the middle what that happens, but that is a neat idea. It's not a bookend where it uses the same phrases, but there's obviously an opening and a close that go together, right? They fit together. Yes, sir.
When Thomas was talking, it made me think, you almost think when you hear David here, he's not going to go the straight and narrow. He's going to go to one side. Almost feels Peter-ish to me. Lord, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do these things, and unfortunately events overtake good intentions.
And it doesn't make Peter less of a person for wanting to be that. He knows what he wants to do and what he needs to do. And like Peter, David fell short from that. Yeah.
I was just thinking, this sounds a little bit like what we do when we start feeling a little sorry for ourselves. The idea of count your blessings, it really isn't that bad. I'm in a good spot. I'm not with those people that are doing this. Verse 6, especially, the lines have fallen for me and flooded. My life is really okay and it's going to be all right. That's kind of what it means.
Like a confident assertion in the face of problems.
Yeah.
Like count your blessings.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Like if the skies above you are gray, right, what do you do? Well, they don't change color when you start singing, but you have a better outlook and a perspective, right? You choose to take that. And David is, I like that you pointed that out, David is choosing to take this perspective. And it's a perspective that even if he dies, that's what gets me. And I think that's why verse 10 is so powerful and why Peter uses it later. Even if he dies, he says, I'm okay. There's trust, and then there's that kind of trust. Right? Even if I die. You might think, well, if God lets me die, then he obviously doesn't care. David goes one step further. He goes, even if I die, I'm good. And that's an astounding level of trust. Yep.
It's interesting too in verse 10, because you will not abandon me to the grave.
Mm-hmm.
But yet when we read in 13, it says, how long will you forget me forever? Then verse 22 starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting the transition that he goes through. I mean, all our lives, I guess, are like that, ebb and flow, up and down.
Yeah.
But,
You're going to feel that way in 13, and sometimes you're going to be feeling like 16. It is interesting. That's why I like Psalms, is you get the full gamut. You get all of it. This is the human response to trying to follow God, and all of its
See,
angles.
I don't know. I'm not exactly funny, but it's last or last week, I don't know. For verse 10, Matthew 28:7.
Mm-hmm.
Where it says, then go quickly and tell his disciples he is risen from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. Good seeing there. It's not a reference. From rising from the dead.
Mm-hmm. You said you have a cross reference to that?
Yeah.
Oh.
Like after death is what David is kind of mentioning here. Not allow me to see decay.
And in regard to verse 10, a lot of, and really the whole thing, verses 10 and 11 together, but people have commented that it seems like David even went beyond what he could reasonably expect. What they mean by that is it's like the language is beyond David's experience. It's true for him in a sense, but it's not completely fulfilled yet. Right? Jesus is the first evidence that it will be fulfilled. Right? But Peter makes the argument in Acts 2, his grave is with us. Right? We know where David's buried. In a sense, he's still in that Sheol, that place of the dead. But Jesus is the first evidence that what David wrote is true, that we would not be abandoned to Sheol, right? And that's an app that comes up later, but let's think about some other stuff. One writer organized it this way, and I thought it was pretty good. If you take verses 1 through 4 as a prayer for protection, as well as an affirmation of his trust in God and his allegiance with God's people, verses 3 and 4. If you take verses 5 through 8 as a direct praise of God, a description of not just that God is special, but God has done special things to him. And then 9 through 11, a confidence that God would not forsake him even if he dies. Right? He says, "Preserve me, O God." The idea of keep me safe, make sure I keep going no matter what, even if the worst happens. Right? Preserve, make sure I continue is sort of the idea there. There are a couple of interesting phrases. In verse 2, there is a kind of a weird phrase. The end of verse 2, it depends on your translation. Mine says, I have no good apart from you. The King James Version had, my goodness extendeth not to thee, which is another way of saying my goodness does not extend to you. It's a weird phrase in Hebrew. It's just my good not beyond you. It's like, what? People have tried to translate that, and they've come up with those two versions of it. I think probably the ESV's version of it is closest to the truth. It's trying to say that, apart from you, I have no good. There's nothing good about my life that doesn't come from you or has something to do with you. It would fit the theme of trust.
Could you say I'm nothing without you is basically?
Another way to put that, right? There's a song in the songbook. I could not do without you. There's another way of sort of putting that. But I think it fits. In 3 through 4, now if you're on Psalm 16, if you look in 15, David did the same thing there, where he contrasted I'm with the righteous person, I'm not with the wicked person. 15 in verse 4, David says, in the description of the person who dwells with God, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. Right? So you despise the vile person, you're with the godly person. He did the same thing here in verses 3 and 4. I'm with the saints, the holy ones, the excellent ones, and I'm not with the blood offers, blood drinkers, those people. I'm apart from them. Verses 5 and 6. The Lord's my portion. It doesn't mean like the Lord's my piece of the pie. It's like the Lord's my inheritance. And when you start talking like that, saying God is my inheritance, you have to go back to the Old Testament and think about the Levites. Because the Levites, among all the tribes of Israel, were not given a land inheritance. They were not given a section of the land of Israel. It says, and specifically Numbers 18:20, and it says it again in Deuteronomy 18, that the Lord literally is their inheritance. Now, the phrase that I left off of this, but it's later on, I'll talk about it when I get there. A couple of those are interesting. All right. What should the breeders have done with the psalm? There's a sense, God is the one who chose to be Israel's God. God chose Abraham out of all the people on the earth and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. And then God chose to persist in that and stay with Israel. God was the one who chose to bless Israel. But there is also responsibility for Israel to choose God in return. That's the opportunity. In fact, we talked about this on Sunday, Exodus 19, when God is going to descend on Mount Sinai and he makes covenant with them. And he says, I've borne you on eagle's wings. I want to make covenant with you. The people of Israel had to agree to that. They had to say, this is what I will do. They didn't just say, sure. It's like, okay, we're going to have covenant back. Psalm 16 fits that category, right? It's David saying, I choose you, right? I choose you to have covenant with and to be faithful to. And I'm rejecting all the other sources of good. If you're going to choose to do the right thing, it necessarily requires that you choose to not do the wrong thing, right? A choice is both an acceptance of one thing and a rejection of the other. There's no riding the fence, especially in this sense. If he's going to be with the excellent ones, he can't be with the people drinking blood. You don't get to hang out with one weekend and one the other, right? You don't get to split time if you're faithful to God. I am going to treat those people with that sort of distinction. Notice also, what do the wicked get for their forsaking God in verse 4? This is just, it's a simple thing, but it's a good reminder of that.
Sorrow.
Sorrow, and not only that, but what happens to their sorrow? Multiplied sorrow. There's added and then there's multiplied, right? I have it and it's increasing even faster than if I were just stacking them on top of each other, right? The people who forsake God and run after, it says in verse 4, another God, their sorrows multiply. It's a lesson Israel knew and forgot repeatedly, right? Kept thinking, gods of the nations, they look like they're doing well. Let's try that. And it always ends in disaster. The lesson in the first 4, again, the sorrows of those who chase other gods multiply. The idea of an inheritance, this is the line I mentioned a moment ago. One writer, I don't remember who it was, made the comment that your inheritance meant something because that was the place you would draw your blessings from, right? If your inheritance is in Naphtali, then the only way you're going to sustain yourself is to go to Naphtali and work the ground and either farm it or, in some sense, animal or other types of farming. And it's from that you're going to pull the blessings, right? The wheat or the whatever it is. To say that God's your inheritance means that God is the place from which all your blessings come from, right? You got to think about inheritance as in the dirt that we're on, right? To say God's your inheritance is to say it's only from God that I get what I need, right? For all of God's people, not just the Levites, that was the ideal. Yeah.
I think too, inheritance means something to us now.
Mm-hmm.
But to them, inheritance was everything.
It was everything. Yep.
Like you think about, like in Luke 12, the parable of the rich young fool. A guy stops in the middle of the crowd and says, hey, Lord, can you tell my brother to share my family inheritance with us?
Mm-hmm.
Just his reaction is, who can be the judge over this? Don't let greed overtake you, and then explains that parable.
Right.
Like this was, for their interpretation, to make God my inheritance and not this land and all these things that I can put my hands on. Well, that's a lot of faith.
It's a development of faith, right? Because God would have said, put your trust in me and in what I've given you, and stay there and care for it. But then to level it up and say, okay, well, if the land God gives me blesses me, then the God who gave me that land blesses me more. He's the ultimate source, right? It's like James's comment in James 1, right? Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father, right? Comes down, in a sense, from Him. Julie, did you have a thought?
You see that in the early church, they took their possessions, sold what they had, and gave it to everybody.
Mhm.
And that was the faith you're talking about.
Now, I want to notice something for you. What tribe is David from? He's from a tribe that has land. He's not a Levite saying this. To a Levite, this is par for the course. But for someone with actual land to say, God's my inheritance, right? He wants to be on that next level. Mark, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, the inheritance, the other part of under the law of Moses, it was the one thing you could count on. It was this,
Yep.
not only it was yours, because every tribe, they had been given by law what they would receive from God. And that was the one thing you could count on. No matter what happened, every 50 years it reset, it went back. So it was the one stable thing that you could count on.
And moving the boundary stones between inheritances is like one of the worst crimes you could have done, right? If every other year you pick up the rock, you kick it over a few more feet. After a while, you got more land. And that was one of the very worst things you could do, is affect someone else's, the size of their inheritance. So it tells you, again, how important that is. David recognizes, and I love verse 6. It's poetic because if God's my inheritance, there are no literal boundary lines. There's no, plot of land that belongs to God in that way. But he says poetically, the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have a beautiful inheritance. It's like whatever it is God's going to give me, that's amazing. I love it. That's really cool to say. Yeah.
We talk about David being a Judah and his inheritance, but you know what? Depending on when this was, he hadn't had 5 minutes to stop and enjoy his inheritance.
That's true.
Because he's been running for his life, or
That's true.
hiding, or avoiding, or fighting, or whatever. So he could very easily feel like a man without a land.
He kind of was. I mean, Jesse had his land, but it wasn't David. He didn't get to enjoy that.
Right.
That is a neat thought. I mentioned this in verse 7. Even those who've chosen God can be bothered by their consciences. What you've done never truly leaves your mind. And even if you're set your mind focused on God, from here on out, and He's my everything, and I choose Him above all, you still remember all the times you didn't, right? And those stay with you. And those instruct you, as the ESV says. In a negative sense, they provoke you to not go back there again, right? Because you remember what that was like. Anyway, so he set the Lord before him, and so on. Okay, applications for us today. The same idea is true as it was in Psalm 16. If you place your ultimate trust in God, then not only will He bless you and guide you in this life, but should your life end, it will still be all right. Right? Even though he's put his whole trust in God, David says, you won't abandon me to Sheol. He's not saying I won't die. He's saying you won't leave me there. And the same is true for us, right? If you think about 1 Corinthians 15, beginning there in verse 50, Paul's defending really the idea of the resurrection. If you begin in verse 51, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. We shall not all sleep is an interesting way of saying that. Sleep implies I have the ability to wake up. Okay, and he goes on. For the trumpet, or in a moment, the twinkle of the night, the last trumpet, the trumpet will sound. The dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. The imperishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body will put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that's written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where's your victory? O death, where's your sting? Right? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. The only way David's confidence that he is one of God's faithful people the only way he's going to have his faith fulfilled and really vindicated is through Jesus. Right? Jesus is the one that makes this true. Because as Paul said, right, we're going to be raised. Why? Because of our Lord Jesus Christ, as he says there. Ross put it this way, and I really, really like this, is God will not let the covenant promises die in the grave. Right? Death's not an obstacle for God. Right? Yep.
And this is one of the, not a lot of places in the Old Testament where you get that idea that there is something beyond.
It is rare.
Because that was part of the Jews' problem when Christ came.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't see beyond this life. I mean, that was,
Because their law almost...
An entire sect of it, yeah.
Yeah, their law almost never looked beyond the grave, right? And the grave is expressed as being the very worst thing ever. It's like David and a couple of others get a little tiny sliver of a glimpse, right, of what it looks like. Now, they may have very well taken verse 10 to just be poetic. They may have just taken as a poetic expression that, well, you know, David's not really saying we're being raised from the dead. He's just being expressive. Like, even if I died, I'd be fine, right? Kind of like a confident thing. Some would have taken it that way, that there was no resurrection. Peter and Paul confirm that no, David was more right than he may have even known.
Let's be honest, typically the way we do it, we have our predisposition, our viewpoint.
Right.
And then we look at the verse, we interpret everything with that viewpoint.
Right. And if you come at it from there's no resurrection, well, he's just being poetic. Right. The question, I think, for me is how do you get here? Right? How do you get to this point where David is? And like Ryan said a moment ago, in 13, he's not there. Or, you know, we don't know which one was written first. I'd love to know, right? What was the occasion that caused 13 to be so bad? And what caused 16 to be so good? I don't know. But you can take some clues from the psalm as to how to get there, how to get to that point where he is. For one, noticing that he is addressing God in this. He's not just writing this kind of as a research paper. This is directed to God. So there's an aspect that he's praying in some sense. He is studying God's word. He is letting himself be bothered by his conscience. He is setting God first. Those are conscious decisions. That's not just, you know, this is what I, you know, did before I had breakfast. These are choices he made deliberately to put God as first and put his ultimate trust there. Yeah.
Do you think that, in application, you mentioned, you know, putting God first, so you could take, like, verse 4, what we're talking about, you know, groups of people that did worship of a physical God
Mm-hmm.
in that time, and then push that forward to, you know, in the New Testament, reading about not serving two masters, but throwing that into today, where it's not necessarily another God,
Mm-hmm.
but it's worshiping something else. Make that application.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, David is choosing, if you think about, you know, the line between, you know, right and wrong, he's not just barely over the line, right? He's decided to go right and to continue and go say, I'm not even going to have anything to do with all of that stuff. You know, Jesus did teach you can't serve two masters. It's a waste of time to try, right? And you got to pick one or the other. I mean, even at the end of that sermon, or towards the middle of that sermon, Jesus said, well, we should seek first the what? Seek first the kingdom, right? And all the rest of this will be added, Jesus said. There's a sense in which Christians, we got to be people who always are looking at our priorities and making sure God's at the top of the list. Right? Every day. Yep.
One of the things they could have got out of this, you know, Thomas was saying, is 3 and 4. They need to understand what's good and what's bad. In other words, they need to understand God's will for them. And clearly, David has demonstrated that. He said, these are saints. These are doing the Lord's will. I recognize that. I use the Lord's standards to determine that. I also use the Lord's standards to determine these other are lowlights and to stay away from them. And certainly that would have been a lesson for the Israelites here, because they would have been around a lot of lowlights in you know, in their movements and goings and comings.
Yeah. What I'm doing and who I'm with are both determined by what God thinks of the situation, right? Yep.
I think saying it out loud, sort of that idea of
Absolutely.
counting your blessings. I mean, David could look at his life and say, I'm okay. My lines have fallen in good places. I'm all right. I know who's right and I know who's wrong, and I'm going to make a decision. I think sometimes it helps to literally, like I said, you have to say it out loud and say, this is what I'm doing.
Some people have argued that a lot of the value of prayer is found in just that, in just saying the thing out loud, right? The power of positive thinking gets a bad rap, but there's a segment for it. There's a section that you could argue that, right? Saying it and putting it in your mind and making yourself think about it. Who was that?
I just building on again and more with like what Bob said and stuff too. I think there's so much power, at least when I read it and then try to move that application to the day and even for myself. And again, verse 4 where it says that sorrow will multiply when you're serving these other things and chasing after these other things, not putting God first. You know, and I can found, you know, in my life and reflection of like, well, when you're always chasing these other things and putting him second, and just that sorrow just all does is multiply. You never
Yep.
kind of say keep digging in the hole, but you never really get out of it.
It's not that the grass is greener. The grass is dead, right over there. There's nothing good. It's worse than being bad. I'm going to make my situation 10 times worse. Interesting. So compare this to what Paul said. We know it's at the end of his life because he says so, the end of 2 Timothy. Right? This is the same sort of confident assertion that Paul makes. He says, this is 2 Timothy, where are we? 6. We mentioned drink offerings earlier. It's interesting that Paul mentions it here too. This isn't the drink offering of blood, but it's interesting that the same concept comes up here. 2 Timothy 4 verse 6, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. The same confidence to say, I will be fine, even though I'm about to die. The same thing David expressed in 16, Paul's expressing in 2 Timothy 4. It's the same confidence, and I'll mention this too, it's the same confidence of the faithful in general in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 and verse 13, the Hebrews writer stops sort of the line of people to say, these all died in faith. Right? Having not received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, having acknowledged they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear they're seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they'd gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God's not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared for them a city. The people who died in faith have a place prepared for them. They have a place to be preserved or secure or dwell forever. And they died even though they hadn't reached their goal yet. Right? Nobody in the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph saw Canaan. They died before that happened, but they died in faith, and they're going to be all right. Right? The same all right that David says he's going to be. Right? Yes, sir.
Thinking too, when you're talking about in the last point about how you can build this confidence with God. When you read verses 5 and 6, we talk about inheritance, right? But it says that God assigned me my portion in my cup. Whatever he gives me, I'm going to be content with.
Mm-hmm.
I push that into like looking at Jesus, right? What was that cup that he asked? Sometimes that cup is not going to be what we want it to, but because like Hebrews 12, for the joy set before him, that's why he endured that. That heavenly inheritance, that delightful inheritance is worth so much more to me than whatever I got to deal with right here. I think contentment is partially what gives me that confidence, that David had right here. Is I'm content. You take my life, good. I know where I'm headed, whatever that may be.
Yeah, Jesus is the most opposite extreme of 5 and 6, where David's happy at the cup he's been given, and Jesus begs, please don't give it to me. Paraphrasing. But then he says, I'll drink it if that's what you want, right? I'll take it if that's what you want. I didn't make a big note about this, but anytime you start reading inheritance language, that should ring bells, right? That sort of language is used all over the place. Jesus spoke in the Sermon on the Mount that the meek will inherit the earth. The phrase of inheriting the kingdom of heaven, both people who would do it and 1 Corinthians 6, people who won't do it, right? There are some who will inherit, there are some who won't. And there's a difference between those two. When you start connecting this to Jesus, we'll finish here in Acts 2, just because it's the entire reason why Peter's sermon works. He quotes from, this is Acts chapter 2, he begins the sermon saying, number one, we're not drunk. Always good to make sure the crowd knows you're not inebriated. But then he says, what's going on is according to the prophet Joel, and he quotes from Joel. And then he begins really in earnest in 22. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. We had a discussion about this the other day about who was in Jerusalem, and the people at the cross were, I think that's definitely true. This Jesus delivered up, according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up. So there's the beginning of the resurrection argument. Loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. For David says concerning him. Now it's interesting, in Psalm 16, who's David talking about? Himself. But it's one of those cases where, though he was talking about himself, he didn't know he was only talking, or he didn't know that it would apply to more people than just him, right? He didn't realize what he said was actually true more so for Christ. I saw the Lord always before me, for he's at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh will also dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades. Again, the Greek translation of the word Sheol, right, is Hades. Or let your Holy One see corruption. You've made known to me the paths of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. It's slightly weird here because he would have been quoting from the Greek translation, and there would have been some slight differences in the words. Brothers, I say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, that's a reference in 2 Samuel 7, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we're all witnesses. Right? Peter's whole point is, David said this would happen. He was talking about the man they just crucified. Right? That's the linchpin of the whole thing. When Jesus is called first fruits of the dead, that's the idea. They're coming for the mints. Right? What I would recommend, because we are completely out of time, if you get a minute or two, turn over to Acts 13, not right now. When you get a minute, turn over to Acts 13, read the way Paul uses the same reference, okay? Because he preaches a sermon there too on the subject. Lord willing, next week, the 2nd, I think it is, we will do Psalm 17. All right? Thank you guys. And again, if you don't have the material, it's up here on the front pew.